Hello, good afternoon. Welcome both those who are here with us face to face, attending the meeting in the room, and those who are connecting online and joining the meeting that way. This is the third session of the Cosmògraf series. I'd like to thank everybody who has organized this series and created these spaces in order to be able to think about a more pleasant model of city for everybody, and also to collect your perceptions and sensibilities in order to be able to work together both in the administrations and in the social organizations. I'd like to pass on apologies for Mariana Oms, who is a councillor that was supposed to be here chairing the meeting, but unfortunately our agendas don't quite match and she wasn't able to be here. So Rosa de Paz San Juan, will be here. I'm very grateful for Begoña and Albert for being here. Begoña Roman Maestre and Albert Salas, they are people that are doing research but also trying to apply it in practice because they're trying to make sure that thought is made reality. I'd also like to congratulate those who decided to work on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and to make sure that we all push together, each in our own way, in the places we are, whether we're in the authorities or whether we're in the social organizations, in order to all advance in the same direction. Today we'll be talking about SDGs 1, 2, and 3 in an integrated way, in order to talk about situations of impoverishment. Something I really like is the way that there's been a formulation for this meeting to deal with all kinds of poverty. There's the question of how we feel it and what it pushes us to do. And what do we feel as a society when we are faced with poverty, and whether we're talking about a poverty which is just material or whether there are other kinds of impoverishments that we need to deal with. I think that's incredibly important that we're doing that. I'd also like to praise having this integrated approach to put people at the center of policies and community action, and to treat poverty as not just the tip of the iceberg, meaning the most obvious cases of poverty, but seeing poverty in its broader sense and more overall sense. And hopefully we'll all be able to share our concerns and sensitivities on the matter. Now, the way we've set this up is we'll listen to Begoña Albert, and then you'll be able to do a dialogue based on their presentations. We'll have time for all of you to make commentaries or share your thoughts or ask a question and take advantage of the fact that Begoña and Albert are with us today. So I'm now going to move on to presenting them. They will add anything that they feel is necessary regarding their professional and personal experiences. As I was saying, we have Begoña Roman Maestre. She's a doctor in philosophy. She's been doing lecturing for many years, and she's still a lecturer at the University of Barcelona, the UB. She's a member of the research group Aporia Contemporary Philosophy, Ethics and Politics, and she presides the ethical committee of the Catalan Social Services. She's also a member of the bioethical committee in Catalonia, because her speciality is everything related to bioethics and helps both movements and the administrations to make sure that this is applied to make organizations as good as possible. She's published a lot of articles in specialized magazines, and she'll be summarizing all her knowledge in 15 minutes. Then I'm going to pass on to Albert Salas Campos. He is a sociologist and political scientist. He's a doctor. He has a doctorate in criminology as well. He's a researcher at the Metropoli Institute and is an associated professor or lecturer at the political science department of the Pompeu Fabra University. His main lines of research are social exclusion and criminalization of poverty and homelessness. He knows well the social movements. One of his sides is he works with social organizations and public administrations to plan and evaluate social policies, and you'll be able to find books by him and articles that express all of his ideas, as I've mentioned. If I'm looking at my mobile phone, it's nothing more than me just trying to control the time that people are speaking for. So I'd like to hand over to you, Begonia. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm really grateful that you came, because when I came to Manresa, it's a Friday afternoon, it's cold. I thought, Alberto and me are going to be on my own in this room, so I'm really glad that we've got company, because it's an issue, poverty, which is not very attention grabbing, and even less so on a cold Friday evening. I'd also like to thank the Manresa Town Hall for this program to decide to work on culture and to promote creating links to be able to think about our present and our future. Having said that, the issue is enormous, and in the 15 minutes I have to do my initial presentation, I just want to talk about 6 points on how to fight poverty. The first is, in the 21st century, the fact that there is people who are starving is more unacceptable than ever. I'm talking about food poverty here. This is linked to the first issue, which is starving, and the other point, which is eating badly and having obesity, because that is a growing problem. When I talk about food poverty, I'm talking in the sense of starvation in the 21st century, we have the technical knowledge for this not to happen. We are not exposed to the bad weather affecting our crops. We have the technical capacity to feed the whole population. If we don't do it, it's not an issue of not having the resources. It's about not having the will to do that. And from an ethical point of view, that's unacceptable. And we've had to pass a law in the Catalan Parliament about wasting food or throwing food away. In a society, there is food thrown away. This is also a lack of respect towards fundamental goods, which is food, which many people don't have. Next point. Even 2 years after the Berlin Wall came down, there was some writing written on it which said that souls, like bodies, also die of hunger. I like that idea. Poverty is not just food, it's also nutritional. There's childhood or child obesity, which is a new problem in our country, and this is to do with nutritional poverty. And then I'm going to another issue, which is the lack of nutrition of the soul, to use that metaphor. There's that slogan, the human being doesn't just live on bread. Welfare policies are not up. We make them fatter, so we don't want them to be dehydrated, and we need to feed them and give them water. But you also need to give people hope. They need to be fed hope. They need to believe that there's a future that's worth going to, and they need to be included in society. They need to feel part of a solidarity-based community or society, and not one based on exclusion. Then I move on to the second point, which is relational poverty. Both in terms of the number of people that you relate to, but also the lack of diversity of people that you have contact with. There's little contest, there's little access to differences. Often, we talk about poverty in terms of those suffering it as having an individual responsibility. That's the reading made. I'm sure Albert will agree with this. Consciously or unconsciously, we have internalized a paradigm which is too individualistic and neoliberal. And we see people as defective when they have poverty. There's this idea that we all need to be self-sufficient, and I don't need anybody, and this creates social problems. Just to give you an example, there's the slogan Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Most of those ideas are not applied. Rights are read in an individual liberal way. When we talk about poverty, we have read it in terms of this individual is hungry, this person doesn't have access to a job, or because they don't have links or contacts or family or a network, and we thus do too much of an individualistic reading of their work. They haven't worked enough, they haven't made enough effort, etc. And we've thought they've had a bad biological or social lottery. And this is where the political scientists and the sociologists are insisting a lot on the structural or systemic aspect. I will now explain. Many of us see ourselves as part of a Republican tradition, res public or res publica, which in Latin means public affairs. And it's not about individuals, it's about having a solid or solidity to society, and there are strong links between people and they feel part of the same humanity. What happens with this liberal individualist approach? It sees poverty as an issue of willpower. It sees freedom as negative, it's a lack of oppression and independence, and freedom can be seen in a positive way as well. But they don't see that the true liberty or freedom means that there's no domination. Just to give you an example, Scarlett O'Hara in the film Gone with the Wind, Mummy is the black servant, and she's a member of the family. She might be black, she might be a servant, but she actually has some control. She even has positive control. She commands. She can take decisions, and that is structural freedom. I want to demand here that we deal with poverty, that we treat poverty as seen as something that is legally and structurally created. Nobody takes any responsibility for them. We're talking about laws, we're talking about customs, we're talking about very big structures, which is non-personal, this structure, and nobody takes responsibility for that. And we end up treating it as a system where nobody can do anything. And that is the third point. And the problem of poverty beyond individual responsibility and mitigating the problem through voluntary work and your economic solidarity and paying amounts to an NGO for them to do something, or going to a solidarity concert. This doesn't deal with the structures which cause this poverty and this marginality or these social disadvantages. We have this approach that we can't do anything, but this system we've created ourselves. And it's based on our complicity. If we fight it, we often fall into welfare approaches. We put sticking plasters on problems. We have turned fraternity in a kind of economic solidarity where you just pay with your pocket, and we feel better about it. But the cause is mechanically working every day, and the same states that create it, they set up their social rights and social rights ministries and ethical committees. Then that leads us to the third point, which is a concept which I will defend here, which came from a student of mine who's going to be defending her PhD soon, and that's the need for an ethical solidarity, not an emotional solidarity, not a Spring Festival solidarity, not an NGO payment that you do every now and then, but a solidarity to live. This would force us to rethink our complicity with poverty and to look for formulas that don't necessarily make us uncomfortable, but do lead to structural changes. It's not just about who you vote for, it's about developing degrowth policies and other radical policies. We can't be always growing, we can't always be following the Amazon model and the Zara model. You must take into account your complicities. We need to think about how things cost. We are in a phase in which debt is at the top of society. And not doing your duties is not fashionable. And I want to say we should have the duty to show links, structural links, and solidarity and support. That should be just as much a duty as paying a debt. John Rawls, the philosopher who's been known, who wrote his theory of justice, he has two different dimensions. One is the more liberal one, which I don't share so much, but the second one is on fraternity, and I do share that. He said that we don't need to get into a totally egalitarian, because tomorrow we won't be equal, because everyone has different talents and different ways of living. So we can't impose exactly the same uniform way of living. But he said that there is a principle that we should apply, and that there should be equality within the system of rights. Those that have more advantages because of being born, luckily, in a better off family and having intellectual advantages, etc., those that have that advantage can benefit from their advantage. Yes, that's what he says. But as long as they make sure that they reduce the disadvantages of the least advantageous. So it can't be an increase in difference between the two. Rawls has a disciple called Thomas Boge, who has an observatory which he looks at and looked at poverty, and we have Caritas in Spain finding similar things, which is that there are more people that don't self-define as poor, but they are poor. So we hide the new figures of poverty, which are poverty. We're talking about poverties who can't leave a sentimental relation, even though they're not happy because they can't afford to leave. That leads to violence, of course. There's an issue of relational poverty when we need to have a deontological solidarity. This should be a debt. This would allow us to see that I need to make changes in my life. For example, how I consume and who I vote, and the municipal norms that we demand from our politicians. What kind of market do we want? What kind of city do we want? And the fifth point is talking a lot about poverty, but talking more about inequalities, because inequalities has a lot to do with this biological and social lottery, as I mentioned, and society. It seems to me that poverty has a lot to do with the lack of hope. And in the adaptational hopes, if you have the view that you can never, doesn't matter what you do, the future is not a place you want to go to, you can never advance, that our children are going to be worse off than you. If you performatively have that view, then the future is not a place you want to go to. So when you look at young people as young poor, you are not creating, this is my big issue, ethical agency, and that is the aim to fight these causes and therefore be full of desire to create, not to destruct things, but to create or stop having these latent complicities which are the causes of the problems. And we can see what we don't want to have this adaptation of thinking, well, this is all there is. Capitalism doesn't have an alternative. We need to be thinking about other positive solutions, such as universal income, and of course that needs taxation. This is an issue, and there's another issue we need to think about, which is that we're getting on a bit. We have an age. Can we be having pensions paid for people to live longer and longer and longer? Because the planet is round, there is limited resources. If someone doesn't want to die and others don't want to all get a pension, well, maybe there needs to be novelty in the world, and there needs to be regeneration, and needs to be generational justice and degrowth. and not consuming more than we need, and not throwing any waste away, and creating links which are global. These are the kind of matters that we need to adopt. There needs to be generational solidarity. And there needs to be other kind of solidarity. There are people coming on small boats to get into Spain in the Mediterranean, and it's a crime to help them. But at the moment, the institutions that we have today, they can't bring in economic policies to help. I would like to end by recommending a documentary which was called The Swedish Theory of Love. There are people who think that we resolve all problems with money. And of course, money can help. They can generate better public coverage, and the Swedish are the kings and queens of that. The Scandinavians have a very powerful social system, but they also have they have very high suicide rates. They are very alone. They have a lack of vitamin B and vitamin D, and they have high rates of suicide. So it's good having a good legal system and a social and having an attitude of fraternity. All of these things are good, but let's not just see this in terms of economic infrastructure. Of course, that is part of it, there's no doubt, but it's also an issue of ethics and which values we want to apply. And for me, these values need to be thinking about us as a human species, and not just seeing ourselves with having a little stand and I want a bit of money for my neighborhood or for my street or for my town, but we need to have an ethical attitude towards the human species, because what is in danger is the future of humanity on the planet. Begonia's left us some homework that we'll have to come back to afterwards. We need to think that we are willing to change our lifestyle, and we need to deal with the challenge of putting light on ethics as the way of organizing ourselves. I'm now going to hand over to Albert, and I'm sure he will give us many elements to think about. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation of being here. It's a real pleasure to be here in Manresa. We've coincided, haven't we? Well, many years ago. Yeah, when we were kids. Yeah. I've been working on international inequalities, and this goes hand in hand with what I've been working on in recent years. And I just wanted to remember, without thinking back too far in the past, that every time I talk to my students about this topic, I'm quite surprised how things that seem like they were yesterday seem a long way away from them. But in 2008, we had a mortgage crisis, it was called. It was a new capitalist systemic crisis. And in this case, the real estate market was most affected in the financial markets. This had a very big social impact. And in terms of macroeconomic indicators, started to recover in 2011 and 2013 in Europe and elsewhere. But the rates of poverty, we can talk about how we conceptualize poverty before, but those people that are in that group, which we would call people who are at risk of poverty and social exclusion, the AROP rate, that has not gone down. We are talking about a fourth of the population that are in that category. So it's pretty good that we take that on board, because I remember when I started doing my first empirical research with those who at that time were my mentors, those lecturers who'd helped me with my research. I did a report on Barcelona based on living conditions research findings, and I started before 2008, and I remember handing in that report while the mayor at the time, in 2008, saying that there was no poverty in Barcelona. Where is it? Now, there'd be few people who do dare say that today, but it's amazing that they come up with those pearls of wisdom. This does happen in other places. We see it in Madrid, this denying of reality. But this led us to the conclusion that there is poverty. In this report showed us that there was poverty in the city. In the period in which apparently Spain was going well in terms of its economy, and in Europe, the population that suffered that phenomena of poverty was seen as very small. If we conceptualize poverty and we think about what was that poverty that existed before the mortgage crisis and what poverty we have now, we have poverty. There's a French sociologist called Serge Pogam who talked about this being a phenomena of he proposed ways of seeing Western society's poverty as having different kinds. There were people who could get by with very little. It was integrated and incorporated into their understanding of themselves. And we can see how in other parts, I'm talking about the West, obviously in other parts of the world, poverty is measured in different ways than the one here. For example, in other countries, they see that people who have less than $2 a day, based on purchasing power parity, are seen as poor. But in our societies, those kind of approaches have been abandoned. We saw the end of industrial pauperism, which was based on impoverishment and exploitation of large masses of workers who were living almost for a century in unbearable conditions, much worse ones than those that the peasants under feudalism lived under. And there's the issue of what were the violent mechanisms that forced people into that pauperism. But anyway, leaving that to one side, in the 19th century or the mid 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, this pauperism fell because of redistributive policies, and the social movements and workers' movement managed to get introduced some measures of social protection, and wages increased as well. They decided at the time, the ruling class, that people needed to be able to consume in order for export markets to work, and they allowed some wages to rise, thanks to the pressure also from the social movements. And so that integral poverty started to disappear bit by bit. And then when they link poverty with marginality, it's based on that idea that those inventors of marginality do so when the welfare state has already been introduced. People who are marginalized are seen as being guilty for their situation. They suffer all of the stereotypes. Because in the 60s, I'm not talking about Spain because we lived under an exceptional situation, an enormous parenthesis of 40 years of national Catholicism. That's another issue. But where welfare states were there, who could be poor? If a Volkswagen worker in Hamburg could go on holiday for a week or 2 weeks a week, and they could buy their own home or be in a pretty comfortable house, if they compared their lives with their grandparents, they would have seen a big difference. Now their grandparents would have lived in unhealthy housing. Now they could send their child to maybe university with not some good technical training, and those people accepted this idea that they're now part of the middle class. But who are the working class, and who are outside of the the middle class? Those people who have not managed to adapt, and they are the marginalized. There's an idea that we have to incorporate them in some way, and all of this use of resources and measures and to incorporate people into society, provide facilities and devices in order to discipline those who are excluded. And sometimes social services are used as mechanisms to do that, and sometimes police forces are used. And this is how the police forces and social services came about. They came about in the big cities many decades ago to manage the poor. The new charters for the police in cities such as Paris and London introduced the police to control the unknown who came into cities and weren't part of cities. So marginal poverty is dealt with particular policies. The idea was for them to be disciplined. They need to be taught to become workers, because the way of keeping this welfare state is for people to work in the welfare state, or the head of the family, in inverted commas, and then would redistribute their earnings to the rest of the family. This is not positive or negative. I'm just giving a description of what happened. Because with the crisis of the welfare state in the 70s, what we see is that these social care policies are changing, or were changing. They evolved in ways that I don't have time to discuss now, but we are now in a very different scenario, which develops from the 70s and was developed in the 80s and 90s and takes us to where we are now. A new kind of poverty develops alongside this marginal poverty, and this is the disqualified poverty. This is people who think that they're middle class but don't have the capacity to sustain the lifestyle which is seen as desirable, i.e. having a house and going on holiday and being constantly consuming leisure. And we see it on this kind of lifestyle in the adverts and in the series. You need to be able to have an opinion about the best wines and consume the best food and tell anecdotes about your holiday, or talk to people when you're on a weekend break. This is a shameful poverty. It's something that people hide. And if on top of that, you have to go to the social services and use their provisions and get outside help in order to be able to sustain yourself, even to cover some of your basic necessities, and it's even more shameful. So the increase in poverty that we're seeing in the 80s and 90s is that disqualified poverty, and it lives alongside marginal poverty. And often these are confused. The tendency is to concentrate on the most obvious poverty, which is of people queuing up for a food bank and people sleeping on the street. And we forget about all this whole chain of suffering which leads to those extremes in the first place. If people have to go to food bank, they normally have been through situations of poverty to get there. This overexposure is seen regarding these extreme situations. For example, homeless people. If you know, homeless people are stereotypes. They are living on the street, and we link them with individual problems. And here I link my speech with begonias. People think, you must have done something. People say, I've had difficult moments in my life, but I've not ended up on the street. So they must have done something. What would I do before I got to that situation? I'm sure I've got a lot of resources. How did they end up there? And if on top of that, we apply moral criteria, for example, then we think they're drug taking, then we develop a certain relationship with those phenomena. And this affects the way we respond to them. We can reject them, and say they're in that situation, it's their own fault, or we can show compassion through and want to give welfare support. But this involves me interpreting what their needs are. Whether it's rejection or compassion, what we are doing is treating the poor person as an other. They have nothing to do with me, but I need to do something, maybe. But they are an otherness. There is an otherness there. And there are specific policies for poor people. That's why it's easier to talk about poverty than talk about inequalities, because when we talk about poverty, I'm talking about other people, or what could happen to me, but maybe someone will rescue me before, bail me out before. When I talk about poverty, I can apply the neoliberal management of poverty, which is a response that's been growing since the 70s and is strong today. What is the response of the institutions and the state faced with the increase in poverty from the 1980s? That comes from the discomposition of the labour markets. It has been one that has been based on three elements. The first is delegation of responsibilities from states to private philanthropy. The best way of facing industrial pauperism, and this happened in the 19th century, was transferring resources to people. But the question is, there is a question of who does it, because it's ideal if the boss is the one who gives a school or a house to working class people, because then they create an emotional link with them and they feel that they owe you something. So private philanthropy is something that puts the issue of rights to one side. In our free time and with our excedent or our surplus, we will help people. That's the approach applied. So delegation towards private philanthropy is a mechanism which is something that is often the only source of support available. And people think, how can I collaborate? How can I help? It is a catch-22. We want to help, we do something, but delegation is increasing and the institutions are washing their hands increasingly of their responsibility towards the poor. Of course, it also depends on the political commitment of whoever is governing. The second element of the neoliberal management of poverty is the shift from welfare to workfare. If the welfare states are based on producing rights, of course, many of these rights are dependent on you working and other things, but there wasn't such a strong discourse as that which was recovered in the 70s, which say you have to look for a job. So to get support, you need to be poor enough, and you need to be showing that you're looking for work, because work is everything. It's the center of our lives, isn't it? And there's also a gender bias, a very strong one. Until recently, it was men that had the central role in getting the wage. Now, that's not the case. We've increased equality, but in a negative way, because now everyone has to have a job, women included, in order to be worth something. If we think about all the people who actually don't work, there's a lot of people. We might be alarmed, and most of them aren't poor. If you talk about people who live from the rent, or rich people, or what about pensioners? My dad says, I don't work, I get paid for not working. He has a bit of that attitude that he should be working. What we see as bad is things that people do. I'm not trying to offend my dad, but he will spend his pension, which is actually a lot of money a year, on buying a car to go up and down using petrol. And he's doing that with my money, with public money and taxes. But if you receive social support, you have to justify every single expenditure, every single receipt needs to be provided. You can't, if you go to the social services, you can't get a load of beer from a supermarket. You have to buy what you are seen, what is seen as being a useful expenditure. There are some social support that is very restrictive, others are not. There's also the criminalization or penalization of poverty and the mechanisms by which we treat the bad poor as not being worthy of social support, and we give them a treatment accordingly. So part of this neoliberal reaction is that we have such high rates of imprisonment today. We have the highest rates ever. There have been some reviews of the criminal code, but we have even higher rates of imprisonment than in the years of Franco. We have a lot of migrants as well. We have an overrepresentation of foreigners in prisons. It's about 50-50. And they're basically in prison because of crimes against poverty and drugs issues. The whole war on drugs is a war on the poor. So when we talk about poverty, this is the expression of inequality. The place you were born in determines your opportunities in life. And inequalities are generated by you being born in a country in the north or country in the south, and that shapes whether you have to queue up to get food in a food bank in the end. In Barcelona, it's pretty clear. 70% of people who are homeless, 60 or 70% of people that are homeless, when we have much higher levels of homelessness than before. Of 1,600 people that we've identified, 60% are non-Spanish. We have a lot of foreigners who are European people that have drugs issues and other mental health issues, and the rest are non-European. Of course, I'm not talking about most migrants. Most migrants don't need any social services or any aid. But of course, they are in a situation of fragility and vulnerability than anyone who has a Spanish passport or national identity card. So the place you are born in has a big impact in terms of your life project and your chances of poverty. It also depends on what social class you're born in. This actually has more of an impact than it did 40 years ago. Social mobility has stopped. If there was a social ladder in the past, there was some times where that kind of worked. That's what empirical research says. But at the moment, that ladder is totally broken. If today a young person wants to come from the lower classes and wants to go to university and they want to have a career after their studies, it makes a massive difference whether they have housing sorted or not. If you're going to be working until the 20th of each month just to pay your rent, it's very different of knowing you have a house already because your family has property. This is a class factor which has a massive impact. Having housing is having, if being in the ruling class is having control of the means of production, then having a house is having the means of production of value and wealth and privileges. And these things make a big difference as to whether you have to get a job when you're 20 years old or you can develop a career and studies. So inequalities are continuing and poverty is continuing. And we're still seeing gender inequality. It's not the same being a man or woman. It still shapes people's opportunities. I'm talking not just about sex differences, but gender and social and sexual identity. If we look at these different axes of inequalities, we realize that luck has, or the luck of where you were born and in what context and what class makes a big difference as to how things are now. When we talk about inequalities, do you know how we don't talk about inequality because then we have to deal with issues of paying taxes. There are some people who would have to pay more if we wanted to mitigate inequalities. They would have to pay more taxes. They don't want to do that. We'd have to talk about inheritance. Half of Catalonia is annoyed because of the inheritance tax. From an egalitarian approach, this should be 100%. So it's luck of whether you were born in one family or another. But we need to talk about these issues. Or we need to talk about the right to live without being exploited. Could we have a citizen's basic income, a decent one? People don't want a little bit of, 600 euros, not to lie on the beach in Waikiri, but just to do basic things in my life. I want a basis to be able to build my life. Of course, there are political proposals. There are some daring ones, such as basic income, such as the universal inheritance. There are the proposals of creating public housing through tax collections, using all the public stock of housing, and creating a public stock of housing. And there's also we do also have to deal with migratory policies which put people into poverty, but it's easier to give some food to, or giving a poor person some money to go to the supermarket or maybe a voucher. Of course, the second approach is more comfortable than the first one, but the first one is necessary, and we need to think about what kind of transformative policies we need to bring that about. Thank you very much. Begonia wants, Alberta's been taking the focus away from situations of impoverishment or obvious cases, but to all cases where people are living in situations of privilege, which means that we need to deal with structural violence of the kind that Begonia has mentioned, or are we committed to preventing inequalities? I have been moved by how many times we have put ourselves in the situation of someone who's in a situation of poverty when they get some benefits and the feelings of guilt that they have for the situation they are living in. So I think we've had many elements. And while you were talking, I was thinking about the international agendas and the models of city. And it's very clear. It's very clear that we don't want handouts in the 21st century. Or assistentialism, but I would like you to say how much have we advanced in terms of developing proposals to prevent poverty, or to or to apply rights for those persons. What is being done? Do you want to start, Albert? As you want. I do have a very clear example of this. Go for it. this is an issue that I've been working on in many years. This is homelessness and people who are homeless. If we go back and look in the archives, or you go and look at the Catalan TV archives, and you put homelessness or homeless, what are we talking about? We're talking about different organizations do with famous people to collect money for them, or are we talking about neighbors making complaints and how we deal with them? And with all respect for journalists and people in this house, we always try and shift things. They say, well, we can't deal with the structural cases. So I think we constantly are thinking in terms of compassion or rejection, and we're not going forward, we're going backwards. My feeling is that we made some important advances when we went from those kind of models of we are the world, we are the children kind of charity events to collect money for Africans. And we've managed to point out that we don't sort those problems out through handouts or sending money, but by dealing with inequality. And bit by bit, that discourse, I think, is becoming more popular. But I don't think we've turned the discourse upside down. I think that's for a very practical reason, because this delegation that I've talked about in terms of passing on to private philanthropists, we need organizations that attend to poverty, and we need them. And it's fair that they exist. But once we have them, we almost give them almost a business role. They have to compete for limited resources to attend to the people they're supposed to be attending to. They need to get private financing, private funding, and in one way or another they professionalize. And when that happens, they are even trying to desperately get public support, financial support, or they ask for money from people. And when people don't have the ability to read beyond the first headline or a couple of sentences, then if you appeal to people, you need to have strong emotional impacts. You can't talk about structural cases if that's what you're looking for. You need for people to see a photo of the person who's suffering, and you can't ignore the whole of society. You become a generalist fundraiser. You can't have a very political discourse because people will think that you're red. If you only appeal to people who have a very transformative discourse, then you're appealing to people with a certain ideological position, and they tend to be the people who have less money. So you need to make everyone feel comfortable with your message. And if everybody feels comfortable with it, then it's a totally decaffeinated message. I want to come back to the idea that we've had too much of a liberal, individualistic reading of rights. And when we talk about social services, we try and stop doing charity and need to have a model based on rights and not paternalisms. But when we try and deal with rights, we tend to talk about individual rights or individual commitments, and we don't deal with the causes. And we give homework or duties to the poor. I think professionals in social services are clean about rights, that legislators want to apply laws that fight against paternalism, but the generating causes of the problems is not being dealt with. And I think we're creating a collateral effect or collateral damage, which is very negative. I'm not against a discourse based on rights. What we are doing is because rights humiliate because they're legally recognized but not actually recognized in practice. So that's a cynical approach to rights. Who is able to criticize rights when they actually are being legally recognized, but they are not applied in practice? So there's double humiliation, because theoretically I have a right to certain rights, but I don't in practice. The right to housing, no, that doesn't exist in practice. Having a decent life, a decent life, the right to physical integrity. So I see the discourse on rights as being cynical. Rights are thrown aboard, and human rights are read incorrectly. We shouldn't see people as individuals in this small group, but we should see ourselves as a society, and society is having rights. I think this has a lot to do with the kind of social links that we want. We have not worked on that. We haven't worked on community links. When you talk about bonds or links, why are we so fearful of the poor and situations of poverty? Do you notice social, or did you notice that society has fear of them? I don't think it's so much fear of the different one or the other. I wouldn't say it's fear, because I think that would take us to a Hobbesian state, which we're not in. But I do think there's a lack of trust. I think it's a society that's very damaged because, as one philosopher said, when the more transparent we ask for from a society, the more distrust we have. Juhan said we live under a pornographic society. We want to know about everything about the other. We have broken bonds of trust, and Albert said a moment, and I think this is an interesting issue. He says, people feel I'm in debt. If I owe something, then this is a humiliation of that debt. When people are in debt, then they're humiliated, but you can read it in another way. Also, people, if they depend on each other, that's a positive thing. I can pay to some mutual association for a health service. People pay for private or mutual health services, and people have said, if I need to be able to go along to the hospital and say I need to have treatment because I've been paying for it. This is a corrosion of the idea of bonds, and what we need to do is the town hall did some publicity in Barcelona saying, talk to your neighbor. I thought, I couldn't believe this. Now I've been living for many years in Barcelona, I realize it's true. I don't get to know my neighbor. My neighbor from below doesn't have any interest in getting to know me. They just don't want me to bother them. If you came and said to them, hey, I'm really pleased to be here, if you want anything, people would say, oh, that person's come to poke the nose into things. So I don't think it's so much fear that people have of the poor. I think it's more about this kind of badly understood respect, where you think that people shouldn't get involved in your life. You think if someone comes up and asks something, then, or offers something, then they'll ask for something in return. We see interdependency as embarrassing, and I think that's a problem. It's not seen as okay to need something from others. We need to be self-sufficient. We have to be, I always say it, the toughest cowboy in the union. And that does harm because we don't have bonds. It's now fashionable to talk about care, the time of care, but care is an independence relationship, one very exposed to the risk, because one person needs something from the other today and tomorrow and the next day, and this shouldn't be a source of shame. So I think there should be the need to not have any need. So I would say it's not so much about fear exactly. If we add to individualism competition or competitiveness, because what the system does is it makes us compete all the time. When there's a lack of resources, then you have to compete. But when there's abundance, you don't have to compete to get the resources that are there to deal with poverty. We often have people in extreme situations, and there's constantly a finger pointing towards people who shouldn't be in that list getting social care or social support. People say, how come we're paying school lunches to families who are not from here? And we're at a moment when the instrumentalization of these cases is becoming a very practical tool to those who don't want to lose their privileges. When power doesn't want to lose its privileges, it goes to fascism and says point to collectives and blame them. So people fight among themselves. We're not talking about big problems with regards to resources. We're not talking about the largest budgets of the administration. We're talking about tiny amounts of money. We're talking about the council department post that no elected councillor wants. We're dealing with the smallest departments with the smallest funding. But when there's a lack of resources, this leads to normalizing discourses which don't have any basis but are taken on board by people. For example, the idea that foreigners get more support. If you become a volunteer and you go to a local church, you would say the same. And the people that go to the churches to get support are the people who have absolutely nothing left. But think about all these people that get 2 years unemployment benefit when they lose their job. Not foreigners, mainly. So if I get ill and I can't work, I will have a kind of pension or a benefit. I have social care. I am protected. If you've never had a strong link with the labour market because you haven't got documents and can't work in the regular employment market, then you have no rights. You have to hope for solidarity that comes from some group, from your own group. And your own group also is in a very, very deteriorated situation because it's not the same to have lots of friends and lots of families. Doesn't matter what networks you have. Some communities have very, very dense and strong networks, but others don't. Of course, serious impoverishment affects to foreigners, but that's because they don't have the same chances of support. It's not that people don't understand issues, it's because power tries to get one group to fight against another over the resources they have limited. And now tying up with an issue that Begonia mentioned, she said there's this idea that we need to be self-sufficient, and something came to mind which concerns me, which is this obsession with talking about vulnerability when we talk about poverty. We talk about the vulnerable. And if you go and look at the website of the Catalan TV network, they always talk about vulnerable people. But we're all vulnerable. All people are vulnerable. But it depends, vulnerable on what is the issue. If I walk across the street when it's a red light, then I'm vulnerable to a car hitting me and hurting me. but there is a redirecting of the discourse to talk about social vulnerability. But all of us are vulnerable, socially too. Maybe we should talk about poverty as well, and also impoverishing factors and factors that create social exclusion. So many issues have come out, so we're now going to open the floor to our audience. Please use the microphone if you want to do a contribution so that people connecting online can hear you. So if you have the desire to do a question or share a thought, please do so. Hi, good afternoon. I will talk in Spanish because I'll do it better. Thank you for the speeches to both of you. I'd like to talk about what we understand by the poor and what we understand by poverty. Because I would never equate a group with poverty, because the group can have identity. It could be an individual, it could be various, or it could be a collective problem. Sorry, these identities. But normally we reduce. I understand the issue of impoverishment. That is one thing. But I can't reduce a collective to poverty. I was thinking about what would we do with neo-Nazi squatters, for example. Are they poor? Many of them. And they help other poor people. Of course, only Spanish ones. I'm thinking about Hogar Social, the squat in Madrid, which is probably the most famous example. Well, what do we do with them? And there are those that we call ourselves poor who practice gender violence. We've talked a lot about mediation and restorative justice, but are we clear that there can be mediation with gender violence? It's very difficult to intervene in such cases. Communitarianism and mediation, restorative justice. Who has taught our societies to be communitarian? Nobody's taught us to, or community-minded. Nobody's taught us to do that. We don't even have the ability to identify gender violence. We can call someone vulnerable, poor, whatever. What solutions do we have? What do we do with these poor people? Do we do re-education? The ones who vote for Trump or Bolsonaro or here, they would vote for Vox in the Spanish state. What do we do with them? I think there are many new concepts which I love. They're utopian, restorative justice, utopias. But who has educated us about these? Who has educated us in this? What about the judges, social services, and the institutions, and the university, the street? All of this is really complex. Nobody said the opposite. Thank you. Shall I start? Yeah, as you want. The first question is the one I'm going to respond to. What do we understand by poor? I think Albert has made it pretty clear that one thing is marginal poverty, which is that you don't reach even the minimum to just keep alive. The expression is, we say someone doesn't have the place to fall dead, but that's not the problem. There's this problem which is organic or metabolic poverty, and this is nutritional, and you're at the mercy of the bad weather. But there's another kind of poverty, which is what we prefer to call disqualified, which has to do with the instability you have because you don't know whether your needs will be able to be satisfied tomorrow as they are today. Precariousness is a new word. Fragility, these are new words. But when you don't have stability, when you are not calm to know where you're going to sleep tomorrow, whether you're going to have a wash, whether you're going to drink, whether you're going to be protected and safe, where you can sleep without being half awake, or keeping an eye open to make sure that they don't rob you. So these are the new figures of poverty. There's the new figures of poverty as well as those ones, those figures. The people who don't know whether I'm going to be able to pay the electricity bill or the heating. I don't know whether I'm going to have to pay for the university tuition fees. I might have to not do a master because I won't be able to pay for that because I've lost my job. This day-to-day experience affects people because organic living does not guarantee stability. But for me, relational poverty is also important. This is that instability that creates the idea, what happens if I get ill and feeling completely unprotected? And that poverty, for me, is even more destabilizing because I think, what happens if I get ill? And maybe it might be people that are economically not poor, but they would not have the possibility of paying for a carer. If they break their leg, nobody would come. They might have a pension, and they don't want to call the social services because they think that's for poor people. There are many widowers in Catalonia who don't go on to demonstration, and they have pensions. And GPs see this. They physically seem fine, but they're actually unstable in the sense that they feel that they can't get ill. These are new poverty figures. The idea comes to my mind, but why should we worry about the poor who vote for Trump, and what about the rich who finance Trump or Vox? Maybe the concern is who is funding them, who is behind them, what unelected powers are behind them. I think sometimes we can be paternalistic, thinking we're doing social activities and it's benefiting people. Why don't they think the same as us afterwards? Well, because they're autonomous people and they're going to think as they wish. And because they've lived through this competition for scarce resources in their own skin. They've lived through it. And I remember some time ago, a parent at my school, where my children are, he had lost his job and he'd asked for a school meal and he hadn't got it. He said, they looked at my income statement from last year and this showed the wage I had then, but now I need this. When we are looking at day-to-day needs, we're in a situation where I need this now, and I look at a list and I see several Arabic names and I get annoyed and I say, these people shouldn't be here. Social reality is simple, that for me, that we are all the same, whether we come from one city or another, one country or another. I avoid any kind of essentialism. We all should have rights. And it's logic that people don't necessarily see things like that. I understand their anger. The norms are the same. The problem is that there's a system of state aid which is ineffective. It's based on distrust of the person who asks for that social support. And if you visualize someone who has read all of these messages and has read everything that they read on how people have come from another country to rob us, that's how we get to complicated situation. But it's a lot less complicated when people have bonds, when this person can have a coffee with other parents in the school, and when they start attacking Moroccan families in the school. The other parents say, wait, stop. If this person is getting annoyed on their own, they're going to be much more annoyed. If this person has a coffee with someone else who says, have you thought about this? Maybe you will manage to get them to not vote for Vox and abstain. Yes. The social minorities that make a lot of noise are just small minorities in society, fortunately, at the moment. Whenever we talk about the criminalization of poverty, the issue comes up of penalization. 60% of the Spanish prison population is for non-violence, robberies of different kinds, and drugs trafficking. But other crimes that are leading to society becoming more punitive, the more violent attacks or crimes, those are minority among foreigners. So what do you do? The data says what it says. Repeated offences for gender violence is really low. It's 5% of people who come out of prison condemned for that in Catalonia. 95% of them do not re-offend the same crime. But people who rob people in the street or rob houses, the re-offending is very, very high. It's really high. Why? Because if you've got nothing, what do? When you come out of prison? You get back involved in your criminal networks, doing the same activities. And for people who commit those crimes, there's all kinds of responses you could give. You could have much smaller centres and give them more individualized support or help. But that's not the kind of prisons that are being built. So we'll have time for another question, if you fancy. Hi. You've talked about prisons, and I go to the prison here. We have some big problems inside. Most prisoners say they don't want to leave. And when they leave, there was a case of a gentleman that reoffended and was sent back to prison because on the first day he didn't know what to do. He went to the bus station here in Manresa. He said, I took a lollipop and I just went round in a circle in the bus thinking, what could I do? I didn't know where to go. He'd been in prison for so many years. And he reoffended and he ended up back in prison. And I asked, what are you doing there? He said, I didn't know what to do. And that's to do with the social exclusion that you were talking about. I've also met a young migrant who came on a dinghy at the age of 14. He was sleeping in the street and they put him into prison. Obviously, he got into drugs and all of his life has been in prison. Whenever he came to Spain via Malaga, and now this guy is about 23 years old. He said, I've never done anything. And he was terribly scared as to what he would see on the outside because he hadn't really seen the world. That's a problem. I've spoken with many of the inmates and I've asked them, what are you going to do when you go out? And they say, society is not ready for us. There's many people saying, there's people who say, well, they've committed a crime, but they're out now. Shouldn't they be allowed to restart their lives? So, and I think it's pretty serious, the situations I've seen in the prison. A quick response. Evidence tells us that the longer someone is able to do day leave from the prison, so they're not in prison under the most strictest regime, it is easier for them to avoid reoffending and to develop a life project after they leave. And evidence shows us that day release is only given to native population and not to the foreign inmates. And we can understand why half of those who are in prisons are foreign born. We'd like to encourage you to participate using the different instruments that are there, so you can make all the contributions you wish. We would like to set up other meeting spaces. You can make proposals on a mural that's there. We will show you where that is, and online you can write on the Decidim platform. I'd like to thank Albert and Begoña and everybody who has participated. We have the homework of to pass on this knowledge about poverty to the different social departments of the institutions. This affects all aspects. It affects commitment, care, and other aspects of society. We all agree that we are not living under the society we want, and we hope that our children will learn from what we are living and building. So I'd like to collectively encourage you to reconnect with hope, and there are a lot of positive activities that are being implemented, but I want to end with a poem by Eduardo Galeano, which talks about the poverty that we don't see, which is the one that's not here locally, but is elsewhere in the world. And I think it summarizes all of the contributions that you have made. He says, poverty does not explode like a bomb or ring like a shot. We know everything about the poor. We know in what they're not working, what they're not eating, what they're not weighing, what they're not measuring, what they don't have, what they don't think, what they don't vote, what they don't know. The only thing we need to know is why the poor are poor. Thank you very much.